I call the honourable member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Very happy to speak on this notice of motion before the House today, and particularly happy to speak on it given the constitutional significance of the role of the people that we talk about. The constitutional significance of the role, particularly of the Ombudsman and the Auditor General, in determining that public money is spent wisely and prudently and that the activities of government are transparent. That's incredibly important, that the activities of government are transparent, and the Ombudsman's role is never more important than when we have a national government. It's never more important than when we have a national government because they don't like being transparent about what they're getting up to. We can tell that by looking at the Ombudsman's annual report and the number of complaints that there are about this government and their failure to release information. Because when they get a tricky question, when they get asked about the tricky issues, about what they're actually getting up to behind the scenes, their gut response is deny, deny, deny. And that is why, Mr Speaker, there has been such an increase in the number of complaints being investigated by the Ombudsman. And that, Mr Speaker, is one of the reasons why the Ombudsman needs extra resourcing, which is what this motion is all about. Because this government don't like being transparent about what they're getting up to. And I want to look particularly at those numbers and why the Ombudsman's office need that extra resourcing. The number of complaints received by the Ombudsman under the Official Information Act in the past year was 920, a 12% increase on the year prior to that, and they ended the year with 643 complaints on hand. 14% of the complaints overall were against ministers of the Crown, which is a significant proportion of the complaints received under the OIA by the Ombudsman were against ministers of the Crown. Now, I want to quote particularly from the Ombudsman's report, where the Ombudsman says, people usually require official information for a specific purpose, and often it will lose value over time. Overall, we took on an average of 120 working days to complete OIA cases. 120 working days, that's 4 months or more before people are getting the information, and there's no guarantee they'll get the information at the end of that. That's just 4 months it's going to take to investigate whether or not they should in fact get the information. So what this government are doing is they're using the Official Information Act, the provisions to deny the release of the information. They're just using that as a blanket rule. If it's tricky, if it's difficult, if they don't want to release it, they simply refuse it. A complaint goes to the Ombudsman and they know they've got 4 months. They know they've got another 4 months. By basically not complying with the law, they can buy themselves 4 more months in the hope that the issue will go away. That's not democracy in action, and we need to make sure as a parliament that the Ombudsman's office is adequately resourced so that it can investigate the complaints adequately and thoroughly and ensure that transparency and democracy and the principles that we hold dear in this House are upheld, because they are not under the current national government. I want to also quote from page 31 of the Ombudsman's annual report. The impact of an increased workload is visible in the age profile of open investigations. Now, the Ombudsman's office aimed for 80% of OIA complaints at the end of a year to have been completed, and yet in the last year only 45% of the OIA complaints they received had been investigated, had been concluded. That's half, more than half of the OIA complaints received by the Ombudsman's office had not been finished, had not been completed and not been fully investigated within the year that is in question. That's of significant concern to this Parliament, because it says that the activities of this government are not being transparently scrutinised. The information about what they're actually up to is not making its way into the public domain. Of course, that's not surprising when we find out what they're actually getting up to and why they don't want to release it. There are other avenues, of course, under which members of Parliament and members of the public can obtain information other than the OIA, but the OIA is the critical one because it's the one that's independent of Parliament. Often we have an issue between the interface between written parliamentary questions, for example, and the Official Information Act. This government refused to release huge amounts of information under written parliamentary questions where they would have previously been released by the last Labor government. Therefore, the only recourse that we have to obtain that information is through the Official Information Act. Well, of course, they use other excuses as well. John Key's latest one is to say it's a security issue, so therefore he won't comment on anything at all, particularly if it's to do with him. It's just a security issue. Now, the Ombudsman is the body that we can go to if we don't agree with that and if we want that adequately investigated. We need to make sure that the Ombudsman's office is adequately resourced in order to do that. The Ombudsman's Office, for example, are looking at the moment as to whether or not information about Cabinet Ministers' conflicts of interest should be publicly released and publicly available, disclosed. A very interesting topic at the present point in time, because the government have refused to release information on the ministers' declarations of conflicts of interest. Therefore, that's something that the Ombudsman is having to investigate as to whether or not that should be released. The most recent advice we've had from the Ombudsman, and I'm talking back in August 2010, was that the Ombudsman thought that information should be released. Information about a minister's perceived or potential conflicts of interest should be released, and yet the government still haven't done it. August 2010, the Ombudsman says, yes, in principle, we believe that there is some information about ministerial conflicts of interest, declarations of interests that should be released. The government still haven't done it. So now we can say that we want the Ombudsman's office to be resourced adequately, we can vote them more money, but if the government then turn around and continue to ignore it, democracy is not served. Because the public of New Zealand have a right to know if ministers have interests in the business entities that they are dealing with in their ministerial capacities. The public have a right to know that. This government don't seem to think they should. The reason they don't is because John Key set the bar incredibly high for that. He didn't declare that he had an interest in Transrail when he was a Member of Parliament asking questions about Transrail. So that's the standard that they have adopted as a government. You can have your conflicts, you can have your private interests, don't tell anyone about them, and don't, whatever you do, release information about them. That's the standard that has been set by John Key's government, and we've seen it time and time again. Whether it's John Key trying to hide his interests in his so-called blind trust that can actually be seen through by just about anybody with an interest, whether it's Bill English trying to hide the money that he was receiving in his housing allowance, whether it's Tim Grosser with his shareholdings in a South American farming company, whether it's Chris Finlayson, matters to do with the judiciary that I won't go into in any greater detail. Clear conflicts of interest that exist, and yet this government don't want to tell the public of New Zealand about it. Even though the Ombudsman's office said that the Ombudsman's office said in principle that they thought information around the conflicts of interest should be released into the public domain. Pansy Wong, another example. Potential conflict of interest there. This government don't think that information should have to be released by this government. I think they're wrong. The Ombudsman thinks they're wrong, and yet the government continue to ignore that. The Ombudsman, Mr. Speaker, the Ombudsman's office, they do an absolutely fantastic job on behalf of the people of New Zealand in ensuring that our democratic institutions function properly in upholding the Official Information Act in particular, and I'm disappointed that this government seems to think that they are above the law when it comes to honouring Official Information Act requests, where they seem to think that they can simply ignore Official Information Act requests and wait until the Ombudsman's office have time to investigate, a process that takes 4, 5 or 6 months. Therefore, the government buy themselves time, and the decisions they are making on behalf of the New Zealand taxpayer, we're talking about decisions potentially worth tens, hundreds, if not billions of dollars. This government want to hide what they're up to by denying the public the right to have access to that information, by declining OIA requests and leaving it to the Ombudsman to determine whether or not that information should be released. I think this government should set themselves a lower bar actually for release of information than that. I think the presumption should be that information is released unless there's very good reasons to withhold it. That's what the Official Information Act says. That's not the principle that's being applied by this government. I think it's a principle they should start adhering to. Thank you.
I call the honourable member